The number was still on the screen when Grant Holloway said it. 172,400. My salary, highlighted in pale yellow on a compensation slide that somebody had forgotten to close before I walked into Birch conference room. Grant clicked once, too late, and the number disappeared. Then he said, "We found someone who can do the role for 84,000. Half my salary." Almost exactly. Tyler Wren was already sitting at the table with a company laptop and a smile he had not earned yet. HR had put a separation packet in front of me and a bottle of water to the right of it, because apparently that arrangement makes professional humiliation look organized. Grant folded his hands and said, "We'd like you to spend the next 4 weeks transitioning infrastructure knowledge before your final date." That was a Tuesday. At 9:14 in the morning. I was 46 years old, and I had been running their infrastructure for 16 years. My name is Elena Marlowe. For those 16 years, I was Senior IT Infrastructure Manager at Riverton Industrial Supply, a regional distributor based outside Indianapolis with 12 branches across Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky. We supplied municipal utilities, HVAC contractors, heavy equipment repair shops, and a long list of customers who do not care how elegant your technology strategy sounds as long as their order confirmation prints before the truck leaves. That was my department. Not apps. Not branding. Not digital transformation, which is a phrase people use when they want applause for moving files from one box to another. I ran the systems that made the company function before anyone else got to sound visionary about it. I built the BranchLink recovery grid in 2017 after a branch outage in Louisville froze order entry for 6 hours. It cut infrastructure downtime across all 12 branches by 74% over the next 2 years and prevented an estimated $1.6 million in lost shipments. I designed the NightBridge reconciliation process in 2019, which matched warehouse scans, invoices, and delivery confirmations before 5:30 every morning. That little process caught billing gaps that had been costing Riverton about $190,000 a month in credits, missed charges, and manual corrections. In 2021, I led the virtualization of 43 legacy servers into 12 properly managed hosts. That saved $680,000 over 3 years in hardware, support, and emergency repairs. In 2022, during an ice storm that took one of our upstream carriers down for almost a full day, the failover routing I had put in place kept the Cincinnati and Dayton branches online and protected $2.7 million in scheduled orders. None of that made for interesting slide decks. It made for trucks leaving on time. I spent Christmas Eve in our primary server room in 2018 because a storage controller failed 3 hours before the warehouse cutoff for a municipal water system order. My husband brought me a sweater and a sandwich and sat on an overturned spool of fiber cable while I rebuilt the failover path. I missed my son's band banquet in 2022 because our old print bridge started choking on a driver conflict and 5 branches lost label printing at once. He texted me a picture of the stage and wrote, "You owe me steak." He was right. That was the thing about infrastructure. If you do it well, nobody notices. They just assume the building thinks. Grant Holloway had known that once. He was 52, Vice President of Information Services, and for most of the years I worked under him, he was the kind of boss you could respect without putting on a performance about it. Not warm. Not inspiring. Useful. Which is better. Then the COO's nephew needed a job. That was Tyler Wren. 29. Fresh haircut every 8 days. Expensive quarter zips with sleeves always pushed up like he was about to move furniture, though I never saw him lift anything heavier than a branded water bottle. He had worked 14 months at a software startup in Austin and another year in cloud optimization consulting, which is one of those job histories that sounds impressive until you ask what exactly got optimized and for whom. He arrived at Riverton as Infrastructure Modernization Manager, a title created so quickly facilities still had to tape the paper insert onto his office door. On his second day, he walked into the server room wearing white sneakers and asked me, "How much of this is actually still physical?" I looked at the racks. "All of it," I said. "That's why you can bump your head on it." He smiled like I was being difficult. He mispronounced VMware as VMware in a leadership meeting and called our storage array the backup hard drive cluster, which was inaccurate in 3 different ways. At the weekly operations review, he tapped a diagram I had built years earlier and said, "My priority is eliminating hero-based legacy dependence." Priya Desai, my senior systems engineer, sat beside me and wrote on her notebook, "He says legacy the way toddlers say broccoli." I kept that piece of paper. Tyler's favorite habit was saying correct words in the wrong order. We need more serverless thinking around physical infrastructure. That was one. Most of this environment is just lift and shift with a few artisanal dependencies. That was another. My personal favorite came in August, when he pointed at the old authentication bridge that connected our warehouse scanners, print servers, and order system and said, "I'd like to sunset this manually orchestrated handshake layer by end of quarter." Omar Bennett, our network administrator, blinked twice. Then he said, "That handshake layer is why the scanners can talk to the order system." Tyler nodded like Omar had confirmed his point. "Exactly," he said. "So once we abstract it, we won't need it." That sentence explained a lot. He took credit elegantly, which is to say shamelessly, but with good posture. In a meeting with finance, he presented my infrastructure cost reduction work as the first phase of his modernization roadmap. Grant let him do it. Not because Grant was fooled. Grant had been in those meetings. He knew whose spreadsheets he was looking at. But Tyler was cheaper. And cheaper makes intelligent people behave in very embarrassing ways. Priya noticed it first. She came into my office on August 6th, shut the door behind her, and said, "Are they doing that thing where they say modernization until it means you?" I leaned back in my chair. "What thing?" "That thing," she said, "where a 29-year-old with a tablet starts asking for your rumbooks, your vendor matrix, and your salary band in the same week." I looked at her for a second. "You saw the salary band part?" "I saw HR come out of Grant's office carrying comp sheets," she said. "And Tyler just asked me if your after-hours escalation approvals are documented or relationship-based." Which is a very specific question from a man who still thinks DNS is a type of storage. That was Priya. Dry. Efficient. Usually right. I said, "Document everything." She said, "Already am." The next week, Omar caught Tyler trying to schedule a domain controller reboot during the Monday morning branch opening window. Not because he was reckless on purpose. That would have required understanding the risk first. He just didn't know that our legacy authentication timing still touched branch order entry at exactly the wrong point every Monday. Omar stopped him in the hallway and told me about it later. He said the environment felt too permission-heavy, Omar said. "What did you say?" "I said systems with consequences usually are." Grant's behavior changed in increments. He started using phrases like cost alignment and role recalibration. He asked for cleaner documentation, which I provided. He asked me to record transition videos for resiliency, which I also provided. Then he asked me to map every after-hours vendor call path, every branch escalation tree, every server maintenance dependency, and every password vault procedure into one transition binder. I gave him that too. 113 pages. I was not hiding anything. That part matters. Because people hear stories like this and assume the leverage must have been some secret I buried on the way out. It wasn't. My leverage was simpler and much more offensive to people like Tyler. I knew what things meant. I knew that the old Atlas cluster in our secondary room still hosted 2 dependencies nobody thought about until midnight. I knew the legacy auth bridge looked boring until you touched it and 5 branches lost scanners. I knew which vendor engineer in St. Louis would actually answer at 2 a.m., which branch manager would understate a problem to avoid blame, and which alert could wait 20 minutes versus which one needed a car turned around. That is not tribal knowledge. That is called having done the job. By the 3rd week of August, Tyler had started referring to the November migration plan as if it already belonged to him. The plan itself did belong to me. I had written the original sequencing proposal back in June, migrate the archive hosts first, validate print services second, move the Atlas cluster third, leave the auth bridge for its own dedicated window with rollback pre-staged, and never touch Atlas and the auth bridge on the same night. Never. Not because of superstition. Because both systems leaned on the same ugly patch of history, and if you broke them together, order entry, warehouse labels, and overnight data replication all started tripping over one another. I explained this to Tyler twice in person, once in a transition document, and once in an email with the subject line, November Migration Risk Notes. Please read before cutover planning. He replied, got it. Helpful context. That was all. 2 words. Period. Helpful context. People type helpful context when they have no intention of respecting the warning. The betrayal meeting happened 3 days later. Birch conference room. 2nd floor. Frosted glass wall. Too much air conditioning and not enough oxygen, which is a common design choice in rooms where companies like to say disappointing things. Grant was there. Marcy Bell from HR was there. Tyler was already seated with his laptop open and my transition binder in front of him like he had bought it. Marcy slid the packet toward me. Elena, as part of our infrastructure modernization initiative, we are eliminating your current role effective September 30th. I looked at Grant. He said, we've benchmarked the position differently going forward. Differently. That was the word. Not worse. Not cheaper. Just differently. Corporate language is very good at laundering intent. I asked, you're eliminating the role or replacing the salary? Marcy's expression changed by maybe half an inch. Grant said, Tyler will assume infrastructure leadership after a 4-week transition. Tyler folded his hands and added, I really want this to be collaborative. I think fresh eyes will help. I looked at him. Fresh eyes usually do, I said. Once they know what they're looking at. He smiled, but only with the part of his face that had practiced it. Marcy pointed to the signature line. We're offering 8 weeks of severance. I looked down at the paper. Return of equipment. Confidentiality. Non-disparagement. Standard language written by people who always seem shocked when anyone actually reads it. The vent above the door kicked harder. Somewhere out in the hallway a copier started its little grinding warm-up noise. Grant would not look directly at me anymore. Tyler was tapping a pen against my binder as if it already belonged to his desk. I asked, who approved the November migration sequence? Grant said, that will be Tyler's program. I said, that wasn't my question. A pause. Then Grant said, we'll manage it. There are moments when someone tells you exactly how this ends for them, and they have no idea they just did it. That was one. I closed the packet. Understood, I said. Marcy said, you'll stay through September 30th for transition? I stood up. Yes, I said. I'll behave professionally. That sentence landed harder than anything louder would have. Tyler started to say something about partnership. I picked up my notebook and left before he could finish embarrassing himself. The next 4 weeks were not dramatic. They were precise. I trained him. I walked him through the vendor matrix, the maintenance windows, the alert categories, the branch failover order, the vault access, the aging UPS problem in Lexington, the storage threshold that looked safe until quarter end, the difference between a noisy alert and a meaningful one, and the exact reason the November migration could not combine Atlas and the NightBridge in the same cutover. He nodded often. He retained selectively. Priya sat in on 3 of the handoff sessions and afterward said, he keeps writing down nouns and ignoring verbs. That was exactly right. He loved the names of systems. He did not care what they did to each other under stress. On my last Friday, I sent Grant, Tyler, Priya, Omar, and HR one final transition email. It summarized every open item, every deferred risk, every vendor renewal date, and every red flag system. The November section was 3 bullet points long and extremely plain. Do not schedule Atlas and NightBridge in the same maintenance window. Do not move branch print services until scanner authentication validates cleanly. Rollback must remain available until 6 a.m. branch open. Tyler replied at 4:11 p.m. Received. We're in good shape. I forwarded that message to my personal notes email with no commentary and went home. What they didn't know was that I had started preparing for my exit the day Priya mentioned the salary sheets. Not sabotage. Preparation. On August 6th, I updated my personal professional archive, my authored runbooks, project timelines, meeting notes, and risk memos. all of which I had maintained for years because memory is a terrible filing system and companies become very selective about what they remember once money gets involved. On August 14th, I formed a simple LLC I had been meaning to set up anyway for occasional disaster recovery audits and conference work, Marlowe Continuity Advisory. On August 19th, after Tyler sent me that helpful context reply, I had my attorney review a standard emergency consulting agreement. $500 an hour. 4-hour minimum. After-hours work billed portal to resolution, rounded up to the nearest half hour. Payment due on receipt for the first engagement. Not because I wanted them to fail. Because I had watched a 29-year-old with half my salary and twice my confidence skim a migration plan that could shut down 3 states' worth of branch operations if he handled it like a slide deck. Reality has no loyalty to optimism. September ended. Then October. No one called. That told me one of two things. Either Tyler had learned faster than I expected, or he was postponing the dangerous part until he thought nobody associated it with me anymore. By the second week of November, I had my answer. Priya texted me on a Tuesday at 10:47 p.m. Are you awake? I was. I had a book open and a cup of tea that had gone cold 15 minutes earlier. I looked at the screen for a second, then typed back, yes. Her reply came immediately. They started the migration tonight. Of course they did. I asked, which part? A pause. Then, Atlas and outage. Same window. I set the book down. There are mistakes people make because they are tired. Because they are rushed. Because something unexpected changes. And then there are mistakes they make because someone warned them and they decided the warning was old-fashioned. This was the second kind. I wrote, who approved it? Priya sent back one word. Tyler. At 10:52, my phone lit up with Tyler's name. Not a call. A text. Need quick context on legacy dependency handshake. Unexpected replication behavior during cutover. Can you advise fastest path? I read it once. Then again. Unexpected replication behavior. That was what he was calling it at 10:52, which meant the problem had already moved past confusing and into expensive. I typed 4 words. Read my September email. He responded in 23 seconds. We did. This is different. That was quick. Defensive. Not yet scared. I set the phone face down on the table. At 10:56, Omar called. I answered. Elena, he said, too fast. I know you don't work here anymore. I know that. I'm just telling you where we are. Tell me. Atlas came up dirty. Auth-bridge didn't rebind cleanly. Branch scanners are dropping logins, print queues are backing up, and the overnight replication job is stacking errors. I stood and walked into the kitchen. How many branches? 6 confirmed. Maybe 8 in the next 10 minutes. And Tyler. Still saying it's a sequencing issue. It is a sequencing issue. No, I mean he's saying it like that's reassuring. That made me smile despite myself. I asked, did they preserve rollback? Silence. Then Omar said, not fully. There it was. The second, bigger problem. Because if rollback was no longer clean, this had stopped being a bad cutover and become a live overnight recovery with branch open 6 hours away. Omar lowered his voice. Elena, everything's falling apart since you left. Shipping can't print labels in Evansville. Dayton can't authenticate scanners. And finance just called because if NightBridge misses its window, tomorrow's invoice batch won't post right. That was the whole company now. Not just IT. Warehouse. Shipping. Finance. Morning orders. Trucks that would not leave because a man with nice sneakers wanted to prove legacy systems were a mindset problem. I asked, where's Grant? In the war room. Who else? Tyler, Priya, 2 contractors, and now probably God. At 10:58, Tyler called. This time it was voice, not text. I let it ring. Then stop. Then ring again. I answered on the second call. His voice had changed. The gloss was still there, but now it had panic under it. Elena, hey, I know this is late, but we have a critical migration event, and I just need maybe 10 minutes of directional help to stabilize the environment. Directional help, I repeated. Yes, just quick context. We're seeing non-standard behavior on the authentication side, and the Atlas rollback isn't behaving the way the documentation suggested. The documentation suggested not doing this together. A pause. Then, right, but we're past that. Yes, I said. You are. He inhaled sharply. We need to stay solution-oriented. I looked at the clock on the microwave. 10:59 p.m. Then read the rollback section, I said, and hung up. 1 minute later, my personal cell lit up again. Not Tyler. Grant Holloway. 11 p.m. exactly. In 16 years, Grant had never called me that late unless a building was on fire or about to be. I looked at his name on the screen and thought about Birch conference room, the compensation slide, Tyler tapping a pen against my binder, and Grant saying, "We found someone who can do the role for 84. The phone kept ringing. I picked it up on the fourth ring. "Grant," I said. And that was when the real night started. Grant did not waste time pretending it was social. "Elena," he said, "we've had a serious migration failure." I stood in my kitchen and looked at the microwave clock. 11 p.m. I gathered that. He exhaled once, quietly. "We need your help stabilizing the environment tonight." I said, "My emergency consulting rate is $500 an hour. 4-hour minimum. After hours starts now, not when I open a laptop." Silence. Then, "That's fine. I'll need a signed consulting agreement before I touch anything." Another pause. "Elena, this is an active incident." "Yes," I said. "Which is why you should sign quickly." He knew me well enough not to argue with that tone. He said, "Send it." I already had it in a folder called templates. Not because I am mystical. Because I pay attention. At 11:04, I emailed the agreement from Marlowe Continuity Advisory. At 11:09, it came back signed. At 11:11, accounting authorized the first payment. By 11:13, I was on a bridge call with Grant, Tyler, Priya, Omar, and 2 contractors who sounded like men regretting earlier optimism. Tyler started talking first. "We're seeing asymmetric replication behavior across the Atlas layer and some authentication dissonance on the branch side." "Stop," I said. He stopped. "Did you preserve the 940 snapshot on Atlas?" "A beat," Omar answered. "Yes. Snapshot's still there." "Good. Did anyone make post-cutover writes to outage after the scanner failure started?" Priya said, "A few. Not many." "Fine. Freeze them. No more writes." Omar, "Roll Atlas to the 940 snapshot." Priya, "Isolate outage and bring scanner authentication back on the old bind path. Do not try to make it pretty tonight. We're restoring function, not chasing pride." One of the contractors said, "That may create temporary sync gaps." "It will," I said. "Temporary beats dead." Grant said, "Do it." Tyler tried again. "If we're already rolling Atlas, there may be an opportunity to complete the modernization objective while we're inside the window." "Tyler," I said. He stopped. "Tonight is no longer about your objective." The line went very quiet. Omar made a sound that could have been a cough if you were feeling charitable. For the next 3 hours, I ran the incident from my kitchen table with a legal pad, a cooling cup of tea, and the kind of clarity that only arrives after someone else has finally made the exact mistake you wrote down in advance. Atlas rolled back cleanly. outage came back uglier than anyone wanted, but alive. Scanner logins returned to 4 branches first, then 6, then 10. Evansville and Dayton needed manual work at open, but they opened. At 2:18 a.m., NightBridge started late but not dead. At 2:31, I said, "You're stable enough to survive morning." Grant said, "Elena, thank you." I said, "You're at 3 hours and 31 minutes. I'll stay on until 3 o'clock. Then you'll have your 4. Tyler said, "Can I ask one question?" "You can ask." A pause. Then, "Did you know this would happen?" I looked down at the legal pad. "I knew you were warned." At 3:02 a.m., I hung up. At 7:14, I sent invoice number 1. 5 hours, rounded to the nearest half hour. $2,500. Paid by 8:06. That should have been the part of the story where everyone learned something. It was not. By the end of the second week, Riverton had turned Tyler's one bad cutover into a company-wide mess with 4 separate flavors of damage. The technical problem was the obvious one. Atlas had been restored, but the environment was no longer clean. 2 branches were running on temporary authentication paths, warehouse print services were limping along on partial trust mappings, and the overnight reconciliation job had missed enough checks that finance had to spend 2 mornings manually verifying invoice batches before anything posted. That alone was costing them time, cash, and the remaining patience of people who had not yet realized they should be looking for exit ramps. The relational problem arrived on Thursday. Riverton's largest municipal utility account, the one spread across Indiana and Ohio that generated $8.9 million a year, received duplicate shipment confirmations on one order, no confirmation on another, and a pricing hold on a third because NightBridge had not reconciled cleanly. Their operations team wanted a recovery call. Grant invited Tyler. That was his mistake. Priya texted me 15 minutes after the call ended. Did you know he used the phrase cosmetic synchronization noise with a municipal client? I called her. What happened? She laughed once, but there was no humor in it. He told them the order issues were cosmetic synchronization noise from a back-end uplift event. I said, of course he did. He also said there was no operational risk. I walked into the living room and sat down. While 3 branches were still on temporary authentication. Yes. And how did they take that? Priya let out a breath. They asked him a very simple question. They asked whether Riverton could guarantee next-day dispatch on their emergency stock orders if another overnight job failed. I said, what did he say? He said we were directionally confident. I closed my eyes for 1 second. Priya continued. Grant was on the call. Sales was on the call. 2 people from executive leadership were on the call. Tyler said directionally confident out loud to a customer who buys backup valves for water systems. And then, they said if we couldn't provide one named technical owner and a written recovery plan by Monday, they would start moving their winter emergency volume to a competitor. $8.9 million. Not theoretical. Not someday. Winter emergency volume. The kind of business that remembers exactly who made it improvise in January. That same afternoon, Grant emailed me asking for a short paid advisory session to review stabilization priorities. I replied with my attached agreement and a 1-line note. Same rate. Same minimum. He signed in 11 minutes. Invoice number 2. 6 hours for a remote stabilization review, written recovery sequence, and a plain English executive brief explaining why, directionally confident, was not a real recovery strategy. I kept it factual. Branch dependencies. Print order. Authentication cleanup. Customer communications. No speeches. At the bottom, I included 1 sentence. Do not schedule any additional decommissioning work until branch authentication, label printing, and NightBridge validations run clean for 5 consecutive business days. Grant thanked me. Tyler did not. By Friday evening, Tyler had ignored that instruction too. Omar called at 6:42 p.m. He said, "You're going to enjoy this less than I did." That sounds promising. Tyler retired the old print broker. I stood up. Why? He said we needed to remove legacy clutter before the Monday customer review. Was branch validation complete? No. Were the fallback queues mapped? Also no. That was invoice number 3. Another emergency. Another signed agreement. Another after-hours call where Tyler tried to use vocabulary as a flotation device, while Priya and Omar did the actual work of keeping branches alive. This one ran 5.5 hours. Warehouse labels failed in Louisville, Lexington, and Cincinnati. Transfer tickets queued but would not release. Shipping supervisors started handwriting pick confirmations because trucks do not care about your modernization narrative. By 11:20 p.m., we had a temporary queue broker back in place and enough order flow restored to keep Saturday loading from turning into a full weekend spill. Grant sounded older at the end of that call. He said, "How many times can this happen?" I said, "As many times as you leave the same person in charge of it." He did not answer. The financial problem surfaced on Monday morning. NightBridge had missed or partially missed enough validation windows that Riverton delayed $2.3 million in invoice posting across 4 branches. That did not mean the company had lost $2.3 million forever. It meant finance could not post it on time, collections shifted, cash forecasting broke, and the executive committee suddenly had to care about infrastructure in the way executives only do once the numbers leave the server room and walk into treasury. Omar told me finance had spent half the morning reconciling orders by hand. Priya told me branch managers were now saving screenshots because nobody trusted the overnight jobs to tell the same story twice. And then Tyler made the public mistake that ended whatever protection was still hanging around him. Grant held an executive recovery review on Tuesday. Video on. Branch leaders, finance, sales, executive committee. Tyler shared his screen to walk everyone through what he called the forward state migration posture. He also, without realizing it, shared my final transition email. The one with the 3 bullet points. Do not schedule Atlas and outage in the same maintenance window. Do not move branch print services until scanner authentication validates cleanly. Rollback must remain available until 6 a.m. branch open. Everyone saw it. There it was. Plain. Dated. Sent to him, Grant, Priya, Omar, and HR on my last Friday. Grant said, Tyler. Scroll back. Tyler did not. Grant said it again. Tyler scrolled. The room read in silence. Then Tyler said, those notes were framed as transition guidance, not binding operational doctrine. It was a spectacular sentence. Wrong in every direction. Priya told me later that nobody said anything for 3 full seconds, which, on a corporate video call, is roughly the same as a church bell. Then one of the finance leaders asked, you received a written warning against combining the systems and did it anyway? Tyler said, we made an efficiency decision based on available windows. That was the moment. Not because anyone shouted. Because every person on that call now understood that the outage had not come from bad luck. It had come from a man who had been warned clearly and translated the warning into an opinion because respecting it would have required him to admit he was not the smartest person on the call. By Wednesday, senior leadership had taken the migration issue away from Tyler on paper, but not in practice, which is one of those half measures companies take right before they spend real money. He was no longer leading the modernization workstream. He was now supporting coordinated recovery, which meant the same mess, new phrasing. That afternoon, Priya resigned. Not dramatically. She walked into Grant's office, came back out, sat at her desk, and sent me a text. I'm done letting a man with glossary-level knowledge blame me for gravity. I called her. Are you sure? Yes. Where are you going? Somewhere that knows the difference between cloud vocabulary and infrastructure. That seems reasonable. She laughed. Then she said, quieter, I stayed as long as I did because of you. I knew what she meant. That made it worse. Omar lasted 48 more hours. He called me Thursday night and said, I got blamed for not challenging the print decommission hard enough. I said, you did challenge it. I know. And I'm not doing the thing where I become the memory hole for somebody else's stupid decision. He resigned Friday morning. That was the real breaking point. Not the servers. Not even the client escalation. It was when the 2 people who actually understood the environment decided Riverton was no longer a place where competence would be protected. That afternoon, the 4th invoice happened. Grant called and said, very plainly, I need you on with executive leadership and finance at 4. Paid. Same rate. I said, send the agreement. He did. Invoice number 4. 8 hours that day between the call, the recovery framework, and the documentation package they suddenly wanted in language everyone could understand. I explained exactly what was broken, exactly what had been ignored, exactly what would continue to fail if Priya and Omar walked, and exactly why a customer already had 1 foot out the door. When I finished, Grant said, what would it take to get you back in some capacity? I said, not some capacity. He was quiet. Then he said, what does that mean? It means you replace me with $84,000 and a title. You can live with $84,000 until you're ready to fix the mistake honestly. Silence. Then he said, understood. No one says understood like that unless they don't. The compliance problem arrived the next morning. Quarter-end control testing had started early because finance no longer trusted the overnight environment. Once they looked, they found what anyone sensible would expect after 2 panicked recoveries led by the wrong person: incomplete change records, backup validations not signed off properly, admin actions taken during the outage without full retention notes, and one especially stupid shortcut where Tyler had used a generic emergency credential because he couldn't get the privilege path to behave quickly enough. That mattered. Not because the building would explode. Because Riverton's auditors now had an internal control deficiency tied directly to infrastructure change management in a quarter where cash posting had already been delayed by $2.3 million and a major utility customer was threatening to move. Winter volume. Now it was above Grant. Above Tyler. Above the department entirely. By the end of the second week, the executive committee was involved daily. The municipal utility account had issued a written ultimatum. Finance had frozen any new migration activity. Priya and Omar were both headed out. And Tyler had managed the rare corporate feat of making directionally confident sound like a threat. Grant called me Saturday morning. No jargon this time. Elena, we need to meet. I said, about consulting? No. A pause. Then he said, about coming back. The meeting was in Birch conference room. Same room. Same frosted glass. Same vent. Same cheap little bottle of water sweating on the table as if condensation was a management philosophy. This time there were no slides on the screen. Grant was there. Tyler was there. Marcy from HR was there looking like someone had just realized paperwork can testify. And there was a legal representative from the company who did not speak much, which I appreciated. Grant started. Elena, I'll be direct. We handled your departure badly. The recovery has not gone well. The customer exposure is significant. Finance is dealing with quarter-end issues. We want to discuss bringing you back to lead infrastructure. I said, lead how? He answered carefully. As Vice President of Infrastructure and Business Continuity. I nodded once. Good start. Tyler shifted in his chair. Grant went on. We'd like to resolve this today. I said, then listen carefully. Nobody moved. I set my notebook on the table and opened it. I come back as Vice President of Infrastructure and Business Continuity, reporting directly to the Executive Committee. Not through you administratively. Directly. Grant nodded slowly. I continued. Base salary, $410,000. $90,000 signing bonus. 0.75% phantom equity, vesting over 24 months. Marcy looked at Grant. Grant looked at legal. Legal wrote something down. I kept going. Full authority over production infrastructure, branch systems, migrations, vendors, after-hours escalation, and change control. No consultant. No contractor. No modernization manager overrides my decisions. If a system touches branch operations, order flow, billing, print, authentication, or recovery, final approval is mine. Tyler finally spoke. That effectively sidelines the role I was hired for. I looked at him. Yes. He stared at me for a second as if honesty had arrived in the room without permission. I went on. Priya Desai returns as Director of Systems Engineering. 22% raise. Written apology from the company for the conditions that caused her resignation. Marcy wrote that down too quickly. Omar Bennett returns as Director of Branch Network and Reliability. 20% raise. Same apology. Both receive retention bonuses and signed authority definitions so they are never again left holding responsibility without control. Grant said if they're willing to return. I said, they will be if the offer is real. He nodded. And I said, there will be a formal incident report. Tyler sat up. No. Nobody looked at him. I continued anyway. A formal report. It documents the November migration decision, the warnings provided in transition, the rollback failure, the print decommission, the customer exposure, the control deficiency, and who approved each step. It goes into the permanent operating record and to the executive committee. Tyler said, louder this time, absolutely not. I turned one page in my notebook. Marcy stopped writing. Tyler looked at Grant. This is punishment. I said, no. It's memory. He shook his head. You can ask us to write a permanent file saying I caused all of this. I said, I'm not asking you to write fiction. That landed. He looked at Grant again. Grant still said nothing. Tyler's voice changed then. The smooth layer came off. For God's sake, Elena, just tell us what to do. We are bleeding cash, the branches are exhausted, finance is all over us, and that utility account is halfway out the door. If you know how to fix it, stop making this a courtroom and fix it. I sat there for a second and let the room hear what desperation sounds like when it's finally too tired to pretend it's strategic. Then I said, very calmly, you don't get my judgment without my terms. No one spoke. Grant folded his hands, looked at the table, then looked at me. You'll have signed documents by 5. I closed my notebook. If all of them are signed by 5, I said, I'll be in the building at 7 Monday morning. The documents arrived at 4:41. I read every line. Then I had my attorney read every line. At 5:26 I signed. Priya signed her return package that night. Omar signed his the next morning. Walking back into Riverton on Monday did not feel dramatic. It felt correct. The lobby smelled the same. Forklift, battery acid, and burnt coffee. The motion sensor outside the server corridor still took an extra second to notice a person, which had annoyed me for 6 years and comforted me that morning more than I expected. The receptionist at the front desk looked up and smiled immediately. Good, she said. You're here. Apparently. When I stepped into infrastructure, Priya was already there with a badge clipped back on and 2 monitors lit. She stood up. They actually did it. I told you they would if the offer was real. She smiled in that tired, relieved way people do when they've spent too long proving obvious things to the wrong audience. Omar came in 10 minutes later carrying his laptop bag and said, I'd like the record to show I came back for the architecture, not the apology letter. I said, the apology letter was still a nice touch. He grinned. Grant met us in the war room at 7:30. Not at the head of the table. That mattered. Tyler was there too, seated off to the side with a legal pad and no laptop connected to anything important. He looked like a man attending a presentation about consequences. I said, here's what happens. Freeze all discretionary migration activity for 30 days. Restore clean rollback images. Rebuild the dependency map from the actual environment, not the slide deck version. Customer recovery goes through me. Finance control remediation goes through me. Nobody touches BranchPrint, Auth, or Atlas without Priya and Omar signing the same document. Grant said, done. Tyler opened his mouth. I looked at him once. He closed it. At 8:15, I got on the call with the municipal utility account. No jargon. No soothing fog. Just facts. I told them what had happened, what had been stabilized, what would be remediated in what order, and who now held final technical accountability. They asked, will that change again next week? I said no. That was the most important word on the call. They kept the volume in place. Not because they liked the outage. Because, finally, someone serious was speaking. 8 months later, Riverton's infrastructure looked like an environment run by adults again. The November migration was redone in January under the sequencing plan I had written the first time. Atlas had its own window. NightBridge had its own window. Rollback stayed live until morning open. Print services validated second, not first. We completed the entire program with 0 branch downtime and no overnight invoice misses. Across the next 2 quarters, unplanned infrastructure incidents dropped 81% from the chaos Tyler had normalized. NightBridge hit a 99.96% clean run rate. Branch label failures went from routine panic to statistical trivia. The municipal utility account renewed its winter emergency volume and expanded a smaller Ohio branch program worth another $1.1 million annually. Priya thrived as Director of Systems Engineering. She built a dependency integrity register that mapped every ugly little handshake Tyler had dismissed as legacy clutter, except now it lived in one authoritative document tied to change control, ownership, validation windows, and rollback criteria. She also stopped apologizing for being the smartest person in the room, which I considered one of my better management outcomes. Omar, as Director of Branch Network and Reliability, rebuilt the after-hours escalation model so no branch ever again had to guess whether a label failure at 1 a.m. was directionally fine. He replaced 3 brittle network choke points, standardized backup credential handling, and created a branch open checklist that even finance loved, which is about as close as IT gets to a standing ovation. I implemented 3 policies in my first 90 days. First, no production cutover without rollback validation signed by engineering and operations together. Second, no modernization initiative gets approved unless someone can explain, in plain English, what breaks if it fails at 10:45 p.m. Third, no one is allowed to eliminate, reprice, or redesign an infrastructure role without a dependency review written by the people who actually carry the pager. Complicated things do not always need complicated fixes. Sometimes they need grown-ups and verbs. Tyler was still at Riverton. Technically. His title became Director of Technology Vendor Programs, which meant he attended meetings with software reps, built comparison matrices, and had exactly zero authority over production systems, migration windows, branch infrastructure, or emergency response. He was not fired. He was contained. Every document that mattered now required my signature, Priya's, or Omar's before it touched anything real. Tyler once asked if he could sit in on a cutover readiness call in March. I said, "You can observe." He observed quietly. Grant remained Vice President of Information Services, but the version of Grant who believed cheaper and competent were interchangeable did not survive November. He was more careful after that. More literal. He also signed the apology letters himself. Hand-signed, not digital. That mattered too. The formal incident report was completed exactly as agreed. It documented the transition warnings, the decision to ignore them, the failed combined cutover, the print decommission, the client exposure, the control deficiency, and the remediation program that followed. Tyler's name was in it. Mine was too. So were Priya's and Omar's. Not as villains. As facts. The total financial cost of replacing me with someone at half my salary came to $4.26 million by the time everything settled. Emergency consulting fees, recovery contractors, customer concessions, delayed cash posting, rework, retention packages, control remediation. The compensation package required to bring me back. All of it. To save $88,400 on a salary line. My son got his steak. That happened on a Tuesday, which I appreciated. At 10:45 p.m. that night, I was not on a bridge call. I was in a booth at St. Elmo with my family, listening to my son explain something about his job that I only half understood because I was too busy enjoying the fact that nobody needed me to resurrect branch printing before dawn. Halfway through dessert, he said, "So are you still the person they call when everything breaks?" I thought about it. Then I said yes. But now they call before they break it. That was the difference. Sometimes I still think about the number on Grant's screen in Birch conference room. 172,400. Then 84. The little yellow highlight. The click that came too late. The way people convince themselves they are making a smart business decision because a spreadsheet looks clean at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning. It looked clean then. At 11 p.m. on a different Tuesday, it looked expensive. That's the part one carry with me. Not bitterness. Not even vindication, exactly. Just the reminder that the people who treat judgment like overhead usually end up paying for it in the dark, by the hour, with witnesses on the line. If you've ever been underestimated at work, I hope this story reminds you that quiet preparation always beats loud arrogance. If this resonated, like and subscribe. I share stories like this every week. And remember, the cheapest number on the slide can become the most expensive call you make at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday.